On the morning of October 16, 1946, a man who had signed the death warrants of millions walked down a narrow corridor in Nuremberg prison, and for the first time in his life, he had no authority over what happened next. He had been Hitler's most loyal field marshal, the man who stamped his name on orders that sent innocent civilians to their deaths without trial, without mercy, without hesitation. And now, history was about to stamp its name on him. But what happened inside those final 24 hours, the conversations, the confessions, the chaos on that gallows, is something most history books quietly skip over. Today, we go inside all of it. Wilhelm Keitel wasn't just a general, he was the architectural spine of Nazi military power, the man who bridged Adolf Hitler's insane ambitions with the cold machinery of the Wehrmacht. For 12 years, he stood at Hitler's shoulder, nodding, signing, enabling. His nickname among German officers wasn't flattering. They called him Lacketel, a cruel play on the German word for lackey. Even his own colleagues saw him as a man who had surrendered his conscience at the door of the Reich Chancellery. But here's what makes his story so uniquely haunting. Keitel knew what he was. He admitted it, and yet he kept going. He kept signing. He kept obeying. That psychology, the machinery of a man who understood his own moral failure and continued anyway, is what makes his final 24 hours so deeply disturbing to study. Because at Nuremberg, that machinery finally ran out of road. If you like unfiltered history, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next video. Now, let's get back into it. October 15th, 1946, Nuremberg, Germany. The prison is quiet, in the way only places holding the condemned can be quiet. A silence with weight to it. Keitel had already received his sentence days earlier. Death by hanging. The International Military Tribunal had found him guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy to wage aggressive war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. When the verdict was read, witnesses said his face barely moved, but his hands were shaking. That night, he was allowed one final visit with a Protestant chaplain, Pastor Henry Gericke. And what happened in that cell is not what you would expect from a man responsible for mass atrocities. Keitel wept. He confessed. He told Gericke that he had been weak, that he had known at various points that what he was doing was wrong, but he had convinced himself that loyalty to the state superseded personal morality. He called it the greatest mistake of his life. Whether that was genuine remorse or a last-minute attempt at spiritual insurance, that question haunts historians to this day. He also made one final request to the tribunal, to be shot by firing squad rather than hanged. It was a soldier's death, an honorable exit. The tribunal denied it. 2 a.m., October 16th, the prison stirs. 10 Nazi war criminals were scheduled to be executed that night in sequence. Keitel was third in line. The executions were staggered. Each man would walk to the gymnasium where the gallows had been erected, and the others would wait in their cells, listening, knowing. Think about that for a moment. You're sitting in a cell. You can hear, distantly, the sounds of men being prepared, escorted, executed, and you know your turn is coming. The psychological horror of that waiting is almost incomprehensible. At approximately 3 a.m., Keitel ate a small breakfast. He dressed himself carefully in his military uniform, stripped of its medals and insignia by prison authorities, but a uniform nonetheless. It was a deliberate act. He was going to die as a soldier, even if they denied him a soldier's death. At 3:15 a.m., his cell door opened. What happened over the next 30 minutes is documented in extraordinary detail, thanks to the accounts of Sergeant John C. Woods, the U.S. Army hangman assigned to carry out the executions, as well as journalists, prison guards, and the official Allied report. Keitel walked with his back straight. Witnesses were unanimous about this. Whatever fear lived inside him, he refused to let it live in his posture. He was 63 years old, a tall man, still carrying the bearing of someone who had once commanded armies. One guard reportedly described him as walking like he was heading into a staff meeting. But then something happened that cracked that composure, just for a second. As Keitel was led through a doorway, he passed close enough to smell the gymnasium before he saw it. The scent of fresh wood, the gallows had been recently constructed, and for just a moment he stopped walking. Just a half-step pause, a fraction of a second. Then he continued. That pause is not in the official reports. It was documented by a journalist who was present. One moment of involuntary, human vulnerability, and then it was gone. The gymnasium had been converted with 3 black-draped wooden scaffolds. 13 steps led up to each platform. The rope, manila hemp, standard military issue, hung waiting. When Keitel entered and saw it fully, he reportedly looked at it directly, without flinching. He was asked if he had any final words. He did. His statement was brief, and it has been analyzed by historians ever since because it is deeply, almost maddeningly contradictory. He expressed remorse for Germany's suffering. He asked God's forgiveness. And then, in the same breath, he said he believed he had done his duty to his country. Duty. That word again, the same word he had used to justify signing the Commissar order, which authorized the summary execution of Soviet political officers. The same word behind the night and fog decree, which caused thousands of resistance fighters to simply disappear. No trial, no record, no grave. He died still partially hiding behind that word, even while admitting it had destroyed him. The chaplain, Gericke, stood nearby and later wrote that hearing Keitel invoke duty in his final breath was one of the most disturbing moments of his ministry. Now, here is where the record gets deeply uncomfortable. And this is the part most documentaries skip. The execution of Wilhelm Keitel did not go cleanly. Sergeant John C. Woods, the U.S. Army executioner, had a reputation that was already controversial among his colleagues. Later investigations would reveal that Woods had miscalculated drop distances for several of the executions that night. A critical technical error with horrific consequences. A properly calculated hanging drop is designed to break the condemned's neck instantly at the moment of the fall. It is determined by the person's weight and height, calibrated to deliver enough force for immediate unconsciousness and death. When the drop is too short, it doesn't work that way. In Keitel's case, witnesses, including one American officer who left a private written account, later declassified, described the execution as taking several minutes rather than being instantaneous. The rope was not long enough. Keitel did not die quickly. The black curtain that surrounded the lower portion of the scaffold was standard procedure, designed to preserve some dignity and prevent the audience from witnessing the physical details. But sounds carried. And at least 2 witnesses present described the sounds from behind that curtain as deeply disturbing. Movements, struggle, sounds that should not have been audible if death had been immediate. Official records state death was pronounced within 10 minutes. Unofficially, witnesses placed the timeline longer. The American officer's private account used the word grotesque. He never made that account public during his lifetime. By dawn on October 16th, it was over. The bodies of the executed men, including Keitel, were photographed for official documentation, then transported to a crematorium in Munich. Their ashes were scattered into the Isar River, a deliberate decision to prevent any graves from becoming shrines or rallying points for future Nazi sympathizers. Wilhelm Keitel ceased to exist in any physical form that morning. There is no grave, there is no marker, there is only the record. And the record is damning in ways that go beyond the crimes themselves. What makes Keitel historically unique and historically important to understand is that he represented something the post-war world desperately needed to reckon with, the danger of institutional obedience. He wasn't a fanatical true believer in the way Himmler was. He wasn't driven by ideological mania. He was, at his core, a bureaucrat in a uniform, a man who had been trained his entire life to follow orders, defer to authority, and suppress personal moral judgment in the name of duty to the state. The Nuremberg tribunal explicitly rejected the superior order's defense. The verdict on Keitel and on the others established a principle that now underlies international law. Following orders does not absolve you of moral and legal responsibility for atrocities. You are still responsible. You always were. Here is something almost no one talks about when they discuss Keitel. In the weeks before his execution, while legal appeals were still being processed, Keitel wrote. He wrote obsessively, pages and pages of memoirs, reflections, and a kind of personal confession that wasn't meant for publication. He wrote about his childhood in Lower Saxony, about his early military career, about the moment he first met Hitler and felt, his word, overwhelmed by the man's presence. He wrote about his wife, Lisa. They had been married since 1909, 37 years. She had written him letters throughout the trial that prison authorities screened before delivery. In his memoir fragments, Keitel described reading those letters alone in his cell as the only moments where he felt like a human being rather than a defendant. In one passage, later published in a translated collection, he wrote that when he thought about his grandchildren, he could not reconcile the man they would read about in history books with the man who had bounced them on his knee. He wrote, "I do not know how to explain myself to them. I am not sure I could." That passage doesn't excuse anything. It doesn't rehabilitate him. But it does remind us that the architects of atrocity are not monsters from another species. They are human beings who made choices, catastrophically wrong choices, and that is, in many ways, the most disturbing truth of all. Wilhelm Keitel walked up 13 steps on the morning of October 16, 1946, and the world that had watched him wield enormous power watched him lose the only thing he had left. But the questions his life raises don't die with him. What does loyalty owe to conscience? At what point does following orders become participating in evil? And how does a man, an intelligent, educated man, convince himself, day after day, year after year, that what he is doing is acceptable? Those questions aren't just historical. They are permanent. And that is exactly why stories like this one deserve to be told in full. Not sanitized, not shortened, not made comfortable. History is uncomfortable. That's why it matters. If this video gave you something, a new angle, a fact you hadn't heard, a reason to think, hit that like button, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to Darkroom Archive. Every story we tell is one that deserves to be remembered. Until next time, stay curious and stay in the dark.